these past months have been really rough. It makes you wondering, does the universe end in a heat death and is entropy real? What is the self-conscious? And more importantly, how do you actually launder money using art? Buckle up, grab a drink. My name is Andreas and this is Artsy Theory. So when I looked into this first, I had a few questions. Obviously, how does this work in the art market? What are the mechanisms? How did it come to be this way? Is it even worth it? Have people tried it and how did they do? So once we understand the mechanisms, we can sort of reverse engineer the steps that we need to actually create an art money laundering scheme. So that's what we do. On our path to absolute world domination through becoming an art overlord, these are the things we just have to understand, right?
Okay, before we get into the how, I think we have to talk about the people who got caught, because we can learn from other people's mistakes, right? So I'll head to the office tomorrow morning and we look at 4 different cases of people who tried but miserably failed. So cue the travel montage.
In the early 2000s, the Brazilian banker Edemar Cid Ferreira embezzled millions and he sought to hide it in art, obviously. So he bought Hannibal, it's a painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat from 1982, and that was valued at around $8 million. And he attempted to smuggle it into the US by declaring it at only a piece of being worth $100. The second was the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia and the US in 2013. So the kleptocrats behind Malaysia's 1MDB scandal, they laundered the stolen funds through luxury real estate, Hollywood investment, and also fine art. And in one instance, about $1 billion were siphoned by the then Prime Minister Najib Razak's associates, who spent all of it on high-end art, including works by Basquiat, Rothko, and Van Gogh. And some of the money was then used to finance the film The Wolf of Wall Street. So the third case is about shell companies, and that was in 2014, and they considered Russia and again the US. So after the US sanctioned Russian billionaires Arkady and Boris Rotenberg, the brothers turned to art. And within months they spent over $18 million on art in the US. And they used offshore shell companies and an art advisor as a proxy. The fourth one is from 2017, and that happened in the UK. It was a Picasso sale. So the British art dealer Matthew Green, he was an heir to a renowned gallery family. He was indicted after an undercover agent caught him agreeing to launder about £6.7 million in illicit cash by funneling it through a Picasso painting sale.
So we know about those 4 cases because they didn't work out. And from a business perspective, before I enter a new field or a niche, I want to know if the niche is actually worth our time. So the question would be are there key indicators present that show that the art market vertical as a whole is suited for our business purpose of, washing money, ultimately? Mexico, for instance, they implemented the buyer identification and then they kept cash for art purchases. And the art sales plunged by 70% in less than a year. So I'm not saying anything, but it sort of suggests that the cartels were buying art with illicit cash, and once they couldn't do anymore, just a massive demand sort of evaporated basically overnight. Now, we don't just want to start building up our entire scheme. We need a market that is sort of stable, that has a history, a structural way how it became to be the way that it is. So let's look at the art market's history real quick and just understand if it's actually worth doing this in this vertical. The art market structural vulnerability is sort of rooted in its history and culture. So until recently, fine art was sort of seen as a genteel, a niche world, and it was patronized by elites, and it was pretty much insulated from the scrutiny that we now apply to banks or, public companies. So we had a lot of discretion, and this was also sort of part of the hallmark of art dealing, right? So an auction house and the galleries, they usually kept buyer and seller names secret, and they wanted to protect the client's privacy or had pricing strategies and this sort of stuff. And that was sort of the norm for decades. So, and it was long considered bad form to ask too many questions about the buyer's identity in the art world or about the funds. And the art dealer was sort of, a facilitator for a discreet, wealthy client. And this culture of secrecy meant that even when prices really soared into the millions, the transparency did not really improve at all. That is sort of interesting because if you have an auction and the price of a painting can rise for about $1 million just by the use of using a paddle or an anonymous phone bidder, that is sort of unprecedented if you think about in other industries. But it was actually the norm in the art world. The second part is the subjectivity. Now, unlike stocks or commodities, art does not really have an intrinsic, regulated value. And historically, that's not really a problem because it just reflected sort of rarity often. And also, for people with a lot of money, they showcased taste or whatever they had. But now art has become more of an investment vehicle. And with the global sales booming, especially in the 1980s and then in the 2000s again, this sort of price fluidity became sort of a tool. And if you realize that you can buy a piece for $1 million in one channel and then claim it is worth $10 million in another channel and actually sell it, and there's no objective benchmark to contradict that, that is super practical to launder money. The third part is obviously the globalization and the free port that came up over time. The art trade went really global over the past half century, more or less, and laws are very local. So for instance, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Singapore, they have what's called a free port. I will talk about free port in another video, but think of it, it's just sort of like a duty-free storage for goods that are in transit. Initially, it was just, for tax efficiency for pretty much normal collectors. And at a certain point, this became basically a parallel banking system for, the less honest people like us. These sites became sort of the groundwork for very complex cross-border laundering schemes. And only in the past a few years, the regulations for free ports actually started to change and become a bit more, strict. Right, so we know that the vertical sort of works for us, and we also know what sort of things have to be fulfilled in order to make our scheme work. So the next step is obviously, let's do it. Never imagined I would do something like this. So in total, we have about 6 steps that we need to do in order to make this work. Now, how we buy it initially is there's various ways. Preferably, we will have an advisor or a third party. We have an anonymous shell company, just something that makes the transaction at the very beginning a bit legitimate to some way. Maybe done by a gallery or an auction house. Just that this, the first step of buying this is sort of looks good. We might lose a little bit of money here, but that's okay. We take this into consideration. Now that we have the piece, we have to store it. Now, we don't want that piece to be entering any customs or going through regulations or whatever. We want somewhere where it is offshore, and that is where the free port comes in to hand, And in the free ports, the regulations changed a bit over the past years, but they're like Singapore still is, rather lax with its special customs regulation. So basically, we will leave it for a long time there because then we don't have to announce it to any tax authorities or regulations. Now, the hard part begins. Layering. Layers are incredibly important. This is like where the magic happens, right? So we want to sell the artwork multiple times. And if possible, it should never ever leave the free port. Because if it leaves the free port, we have tax regulations and authorities that look into this. We don't want that. We want to have shell companies that are owned by, by a fund or by another shell company or another corporation, just to make it incredibly difficult to understand which piece was bought when, where, by whom, and where it went. You know, so when you look at it from the outside and you don't have this insider knowledge, what is what, you just have a complete web of transactions that are really hard to distinguish what is what. And we will do this a few times. And while doing this is a step that I think often gets forgotten, is we have to bloat our own funds by using it as collateral. Now, there's a massive advantage of ownership of, you know, high value assets. And that is that if you have something like a Picasso that is 10 millions or so, you can use it as a collateral to get more funds that are legit from banks or from lenders and this sort of stuff. So we can add very legit funds and add them to our systems, which is what we want, right? So we use this as collateral just to bloat our own financial system with legit cash from banks that will, you know, enter the audit trail. The next step then is we want to have a genuine buyer that buys it at the inflated price that we created. Because now this whole thing starts to appear very legitimate. And the proceeds then from this go into the economy that we created as a clean money. So this is a very clean cut into the entire system. And this leads to the last step is, in order to completely legalize this, we needed to exit the free port. And authorities will not look into this, you know, if you look at this person in general, that will be clean and clean money that is cleanly earned, right? And this appears very legitimate. And this whole stuff before, this web, is just hidden behind. Yeah, surprisingly easy. Now that we know how to launder money, the question is more like, you know, where do we get the artwork from? You can always buy it if you have enough money, but who does, right? So I think much easier will be if you just steal something. So on our path to become art overlords, next time we have to look into how to steal an artwork. So thanks a ton for watching and see you next time.